It was like any night bus ride, the dead of night basically. The streets were empty and thick with fog as the city lights went off in a haze. I was one of the 6 passengers on the express Route 19, heading out of the city toward the quiet town that no one really does talk about. The air inside the bus seemed close, almost suffocating, as if the world outside had just died when the door closed. I sat in the back, with my headphones on, in a futile attempt to block out the creeping unease that settled in my chest the instant that bus pulled away from the station. There was something about this ride that just felt wrong. No conversation amongst the passengers, just the steady hum of the engine and, from time to time, a squeak of the brakes. I looked up toward the front where the driver was still sitting motionless staring straight ahead onto the road. He hadn't said a word since we boarded. Truth is, I wasn't even sure he'd looked at us. The first weirdness happened just after we'd cleared city limits. The road ahead had been clear, then the bus bucked wildly like we'd struck something. The passengers bucked in their seats, startled and confused, but I looked outside, and there was nothing, no animal, no debris, no sign of anything that might have caused such a hard impact. The driver didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. That is when I noticed something strange. Miles back, there had not been another car nor another human being. It was like the road itself had been drained, leaving nothing but us, the bus, the passengers, and that long stretch of black asphalt ahead. The buildings we passed were dark and abandoned, their windows boarded up, with not a sign of life anywhere. A sense of something not being right began to fill the bus, a nervousness that was there like an elephant in the room. One of the other passengers, a middle-aged man with a fit of nerves etched on his face, got up from his seat and walked to the front, leaning towards the driver. "Hey, we hit something back there," he stammered. "Shouldn't we stop and check?" The driver did nothing. He did not even blink. The man tried once more, louder this time. "Did you hear me? You have to stop the bus." He said nothing. His hand seemed stuck to the wheel, glued to it. The man stepped backward, looked visibly disturbed, and sat down without another word. No one else said anything, but I could tell a feeling was growing in their faces. Everyone felt it, a consensus brewing, swelling with each second that went by, the feeling that we weren't on a usual bus ride anymore. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, planning to check the map, but to my surprise, there was just no signal whatsoever. No Wi-Fi, no GPS, nothing at all. Just that blank screen where the route should have been. I looked around, and from the shifting of glances from other passengers, one might guess they faced the same problem. We were cut off. In isolation. That was when I had a chilling revelation: the bus wasn't on its regular route. We were deeper into the strange territory, down a street that shouldn't exist, going to a place that no map would show. The road beyond the window screens was different. Gone was that smooth, familiar asphalt of the Route 19 highway. Instead, we were chugging down a narrow, cracked road lined with tall, twisted trees. Their warped limbs seemed to be grasping at us, their dark silhouettes dancing across the windows under the dim bus lights. The other passengers were getting restless. The man who had tried to speak to the driver a while back turned around and looked at us, his eyes wide with confusion. A young woman somewhere in the middle of the bus kept looking at her phone, shaking it as if somehow the signal would come back. But it never did. That awkward tension, which weighs upon one's shoulders, tightens the throat, and makes one wonder whether he or she is in control anymore, continued hanging in the air. I leaned over toward the window and pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the landscape slide by. There were no signs, no landmarks. Just that unending line of trees, eerie somehow. It was as if the world outside had changed to something foreign, something wrong. "Hey," the voice whispered from the seat in front of me. I looked up to see a young man, probably about my age, turned in his chair so as to face me. His face was tense, his fingers grasping the back of the chair tightly. "Do you know where we are?" I shook my head. I don't. This isn't the route I usually take. It doesn't feel right, he muttered, looking around nervously. None of this does. He was right. I didn't want to admit it, but everything about this bus ride seemed wrong. The driver still hadn't said a word, his body still stiff and unresponsive. And the road, it was narrower now, twisting like a snake into the heart of a forest that shouldn't have existed this close to the city. It suddenly slowed down. In a moment, there was a gush of relief. Maybe the driver finally realized that all was not well and we were turning back. The relief went as quickly as it came when it came to a full stop right in the middle of the road. The engine purred softly, but the doors did not open. The driver did not even budge. The only thing that filled the air was the soft humming of the engine and the occasional groan of the frame of the bus. "What the hell is happening?" the middle-aged man asked, rising once again. This time, his voice was louder, more frantic. "Why are we making a stop?" Nobody knew. The girl in the front row suddenly swiveled round, her face as white as paper. Maybe the engine's wrong?" "I don't care about the engine," the truculent man snarled. "We have to get off this bus." He forced his way up the aisle, hammering on the driver's glass screen. "Open the door. Let us out." The driver didn't even look around. Without warning, he slapped his hand on the lever of the emergency door and jerked it down. The door creaked in protest against the rusted hinges. Cold night air burst in, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something foul. It was then I saw it. Outside, just beyond the reach of the headlights' beams, a figure stood in the middle of the road. Distant, it was hardly visible through fog that seemed to have settled over the woods. At first, I thought perhaps it was a deer, or maybe another person. But then my eyes focused, and I realized that something was horribly wrong with the shape of it. It was tall, too tall, its limbs spindly and impossibly long. And it wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching. I wasn't the only one that saw it. The guy in front of me suddenly drew in a sharp breath. "What the? Do you see that?" But the figure just didn't move, its head turned at an unnatural angle as if regarding us. The middle-aged man that by now was halfway out the door froze. "Call." Then, without a word, he stepped back into the bus and closed the door. The bus didn't move. Nobody said anything, nobody moved, and that thing, whatever it was out on the road, all but obscured by mist, just stood there. Its elongated, twisted form was transfixed, its malign presence holding us all hostage. Every fiber of my body was screaming at me to get up and run, to get off this bus and head off in the opposite direction, but where could I go? The forest either side of the road looked equally threatening. Backing into his seat, the middle-aged man had set wide eyes on the figure. The young woman up front clutched her phone a little tighter and muttered at an indecipherable volume, "What is that? What is that?" The driver said nothing, his eyes fixed forward as if he was oblivious to the world of happenings. But I knew he could see it, he had to, there was just no way that anyone could ignore that looming presence just beyond the headlight's grasp. The air was thick with tension. My head turned toward the emergency exit door, as the urge hit me to try my luck on foot. But every time the urge got at me to step out, the figure's rigid stance sent a wave of terror jolting through my veins. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. The young man opposite me spun around, his voice low, yet urgent. "What do we do? We can't just stay here. Do you think it's—" Before he could finish, the engine of the bus cut out. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the whole vehicle into darkness. The only illumination now was the moonlight seeping through the fog, casting a pale glow through the windows. The sudden silence just made it all worse. Every creak, every breath seemed to get magnified. That was when I realized something even more unsettling. The figure outside it moved. Not much, just a slight shift forward. Still, it was closer now, enough that I could see its unnaturally long arms hanging at its sides, its head still tilted at that unnerving angle. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. "Oh God," stammered the young woman from behind as she retreated from the front seats. "It's coming closer." They all began to discuss the issue amongst each other, some of them standing, others remaining in their seats. Panic was really setting in, and nobody knew what to do. The same dread felt its way crawling up my body, terror clinging to my skin like a sheet of ice. There was a sudden stirring from the driver. His hand veered off, as if to reach for something on the dashboard. For the first time since we left town, his head turned to face us. His eyes were too wide, too large, his face too calm, almost detached. "It's too late," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't get off now." "What do you mean?" the middle-aged man demanded, sharp with fear in his voice. "Open the door. Let us out." The driver shook his head, slow, very slow, his hand tight on the wheel, his knuckles whitening. "If you step off this bus," he said, and his voice was so chilling, "you won't come back." A cold dread fell over the passengers. No one moved. No one dared challenge him. Then, out of the darkness and the silence, we did. Footfalls. Slow, measured, and from outside. They weren't the solidly soothing steps of a human, they were louder, deliberate, and combined with a grinding sound, as if something impossibly large was slithering towards the bus. The young man next to me pressed even closer toward the glass, peering into the mist. What is that?" I turned my gaze and my stomach plummeted. The figure had vanished. But the sound of its footsteps was getting louder. Panic illogically took hold of the young woman as she suddenly jumped to her feet. "I can't stay here. We're sitting ducks." She suddenly sprinted to the back of the bus and reached frantically for the emergency exit. "No! Don't!" I began to shout, but it was too late. She wrenched the emergency handle and forced the rear door open, her breath misting in the chill night air. For a moment, she peered out into the foggy darkness. Then, she stepped out of the bus. At once, the footsteps ceased. A dreadful silence dropped like a chasm of ice, where even the breathing of the world seemed to have stopped. We all waited, momentarily, for her standing just outside the door, wide-eyed and terrified as she looked around. Then, in an instant, something blurred through the fog with a speed impossible for any human and took her. She never even had time to scream. The door slammed shut behind her, and instantly, the bus plunged into chaos. The pandemonium on the bus burst loose. Everybody was standing, screaming, pushing, trying to get out, but of course there was nothing to get out to. The woman was sucked out by something we couldn't even see. I could hear her absence, still, if that makes sense, the awful silence that followed that blur of motion out there a second ago. My mind was trying to process what I just saw. The young man who had been sitting in front of me slumped against his seat, his hands clasping the sides of his head. "What the hell was that? What just happened?" he muttered, his eyes crazed with unbelief. The middle-aged man was up front, beating against the partition to the driver. "You knew. You knew this was going to happen. Open the doors, let us out." The driver didn't blink, his eyes still on the road ahead as if nothing had changed. When he spoke, his tone was an icy whisper. "If you leave, you die. No one leaves." "No," the man shouted, twisting to the remaining passengers. "We can't just sit here. If we stay on this bus, we're sitting targets. We've got to." Another noise from outside curtailed him. A soft tapping sound, rhythmic almost, like something pointed against the windows, tapping. The sound had traversed the length of the bus with its slow and deliberate movement, like claws dragging over glass. In that instant, it was quiet in the bus. Eyes would scan in terror. We knew. What it meant, the thing, whatever had taken the woman, was still out there. My chest constricted, I huddled against the back of my seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moved closer. The windows of the bus fogged slightly, as though the cold night air was creeping inside. And then, it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had started. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The bus was wrapped by a smothering stillness, all seated, awaiting something to happen. The driver was the first to break the silence. His voice was flat and deadpan, "It's hunting us." I looked up at him, my heart racing, and tried to decipher his words. "What? What do you mean?" The driver's hands were not shaking on the wheel because the bus was not moving. "This route isn't just a road, it is a trap. It lures people in, makes them think they're on a normal ride. But the further we go, the more it pulls us in. It's a feeding ground." A woman who sat about midway in the bus breathed a shaking breath. Her face was white. "Why didn't you warn us? Why didn't you stop the bus?" The driver's dead eyes flickered toward her. "Because there's no stopping it. It always gets what it wants." "Then why are you still here?" the young man next to me asked. "Why didn't it take you?" He grinned then, an empty, mirthless smile that chilled me to the bone. "I'm part of the deal." Before anyone could reply, the tapping started once more. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was coming from the roof. The sound was heavier now, more deliberate, as if something large was dragging itself across the top of the bus. The ceiling creaked under the weight of it, the groan of metal as the thing whatever it was shifted above us. The girl beside me whimpered, hands pressed to her ears as if she could block out the noise that way. "Make it stop. Please, make it stop." Terrified, eyes wide, the middle-aged man reached for the lever that controlled the front emergency exit of the bus. "I'm not staying here to die." He yanked the lever, but before the doors could fully open, something heavy slammed against them from the outside, snapping them shut. The force had been strong enough that the entire bus rocked on its wheels. The man stumbled backward, staring in utter disbelief at the closed doors. "It won't let us leave," he said matter-of-factly, as though he had watched it do so 1,000 times already. In a heart-jolting flash, the young man beside me shot from his seat, his voice shaking in furious terror. "Then what are we supposed to do? We just sit around and wait to die?" The driver's dead eyes fell upon him, cold, dispassionate. "You stay. And you hope it doesn't take you." That was it. That was his solution: stay and hope. The helplessness of it weighed in like a stone in my gut. Every fiber of me shrieked to get out, to run, but there was no place to go. We were surrounded, trapped by something that could hunt us at will. Suddenly the bus bucked again. This time stronger. Whatever was on the roof was moving faster, its weight crashing back and forth from one end of the bus to the other. The groaning metal buckled under the strain, and then it stopped. A second later, the roof began to buckle inward. The roof was caving in, at first slowly, then with a sickening crunch. Something was pushing down, buckling the metal, tearing it apart. I grabbed the young man's arm, pulled him down to the floor as a horrible ripping sound enveloped the bus. A gaping hole appeared in the ceiling, and something dark, something twisted, began to pour inside. The bus's ceiling ripped apart like paper, the metal shrieked while some giant force tore it open from inside out. The air was suddenly filled with the stench of decay, and through the gaping hole above, the creature started to descend. It wasn't a person, or even remotely human. It was a mass of writhing, shifting darkness, limbs that shouldn't have fit together bending at impossible angles. The skin was pale, mottled, slick-looking, as if it had been buried underground for centuries. Long, spindly arms reached down, dragging across the floor as it pulled itself through the breach in the roof. The other passengers screamed, scrambling away from the middle of the bus. The young man beside me pulled me to my feet, and together we stuttered toward the rear emergency exit. But no matter in which direction we went, it was as if the thing's shadow followed, elongating, stretching, trying to cover every inch of the bus. The creature's head, sans eyes, turned in our direction. Its mouth opened and stayed open. Nothing in the form of words came out, just a guttural hissing sound, as if savoring our fear. The limbs started to quiver, and he slid off the roof, his body contorting in ways illogical to the mind. "We must get out of here," shouted the middle-aged man as panic laced his voice. The man rushed to the emergency door, tugging with all his might, but it stayed sealed shut. The bus wasn't going to let us out. "We're trapped," the young woman yelped from the front, her face pressed against the window in desperation. Her eyes were wide, wild, like she was already starting to lose her mind. The creature dragged itself closer, scraping its body along the floor, mouth still agape, oozing with something dark and foul. It had no need for hurry, it knew we had nowhere to go. The driver still did nothing to stir from his seat. His eyes were sunken, resigned, as if he had already done whatever would happen next. "You cannot outrun it," he said in a quiet tone, his voice lifeless as an oxymoron. "It won't let you leave unless..." "Unless what?" I shouted, the heartbeat almost breaking my ribs. He finally turned his face, and a character mask of unreadable expression was worn upon it. "Unless someone gives themselves unto it." The words came like a kick in the stomach. I glared at him, my mouth dry. "What are you talking about?" The driver nodded toward the creature, which had stopped in the middle of the aisle, towering over us. "It's been feeding in this route for years. One by one, it takes those who try to escape. But if someone offers themselves willingly, it leaves the rest alone." The bus was dead quiet, the passengers trying to digest what he tried to say. Someone had to be sacrificed. "Insaneness," the middle-aged man shouted, backing away from the creature. "You are saying we have to just give up? Let that thing take us?" The driver's eyes flicked toward him, without the tiniest inch of emotion. "It's the only way. I've seen it before. It's the only reason I'm still here." My mind was racing, and this couldn't be real, it couldn't be happening, but the creature stood waiting, as if he understood the conversation, as if giving us time to decide. I looked to the others, the young man to my right, pale with fear, the woman up front clutching her phone as if somehow it might save her, the middle-aged man, still shaking as he stared on at the thing before us. None of us wanted this. None of us deserved this. But someone had to make a decision. I can't," he whispered, head shaking. "I can't." The middle-aged man stepped forward, his face contorted in a mix of eagerness, fear, and determination. "You're insinuating that so long as one of us goes willingly, the rest of us get to go?" The driver nodded very slowly. "That's the only way." Then he looked around at the rest of us, his gaze darting among our scared faces. Nobody said anything for what seemed like a long period of time. The creature just lay there, silent, almost as if it was waiting for the inevitable. The middle-aged man exhaled shakily. I'll do it." My stomach fell. "Wait, no." He raised his hand, silencing me. "Someone has to. If it's not me, it'll be someone else." His eyes showed the terror, yet there was this weird resignation, a serenity which came with knowing what must be done. He took a step forward toward the creature, his shallow breathing, trembling hands. The thing's head cocked to one side. Its mouth opened wider in a grotesque grin to watch him closer. The man turned back one last time, giving us a tight, fearful smile. "Go. When it takes me, go. Don't waste it." Then, with nothing else said, he stepped into reach for the creature. In an instant, the creature had its long spindly arms wrapped around him, drawing him close. His face contorted in a grimace of pain as the thing began to absorb him, his scream echoing around the bus. We didn't wait. The young man pulled me toward the back door by my arm. The driver started fiddling with a button on the dashboard, and suddenly, the emergency door swung open. We scrambled out into the cold night air and ran as fast as our feet would carry us, not stopping to look back. The last thing that I heard before the bus door slammed shut was the man's scream, diminishing into the night. We ran and ran, until legs could no longer run, until the twisted road behind us disappeared in mist, and the lights of that bus disappeared. When at last we stopped, gasping for breath, we were standing on the edge of the highway, the normal Route 19. The bus was gone. We were standing there, shaking, trying to make sense in our minds what had happened. But then, of course, there was no time to make sense of it, since we were still alive. And that was all that mattered.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe and hit the bell to catch all the new eerie horror stories. See you next time.